I'll ask my former professor a question. When you're at the end of your talk, when you keep logos alive, what are some of the ways you think we should do that, or how can we do that?
Well, that's what I like about the apparatic approach of Socrates, Plato's Socrates, that the older generation doesn't solve everything for the younger generation, but keeps the door open and is very frank. And I know, Michael, that's one thing that you've always done as a teacher is kind of be ready to pass on the torch. Here are things that are not yet figured out. Here's something that we know practically nothing about. We were talking about how when you edit the Brill's New Jacobi, that there's some historians we know nothing about. And the flip side is sometimes there is a great deal to know about something, and the work just hasn't been done. So I'm always very, very impressed with how much work there is to be done. And when I was young, I was told by one professor that everything in classics has already been done, and so just try to go to a related field, because been there, done it. And the older I get, the more I sense that there's just so much out there. And just listening to you three just energizes me, because I don't even want to give percentages about how much there is to be discovered, especially when people start looking at things in new ways and from different preconceptions. And if I may add something to what you said, Patrice, is when we all work with students, one of the hardest things is to convince people who are minorities that this is a very important thing to engage with, because sometimes the families of minorities will say, well, all right, you're finally making it. Now, what are you going to do, smell flowers? And just to emphasize, and I think, Shadi, you did that so well, about how important our study is to everything, to all life. So I'm sorry this is what happens when a former student asks a former teacher. I just won't stop, but thank you for the question.
I have a question for Patrice Rankin. So what you seem to be saying is that, the expansiveness of classical scholarship, right? I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking of Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind and how wrong he was, and I'm sure that's the kind of thing you were talking about when you began your career. It was around that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so what I would like to know is, where do you think it's going now? I mean, what are some of the other kinds of connections that you see happening in classical scholarship that would make it, of interest? Like Shadi Barsha were saying that the connections that we make it, sort of open-ended, as you were saying, and not insular or sort of, self-reflexive. Can you reflect upon that a little bit?
I'll be brief, because I think it's a kind of question that actually pertains to every panelist and our approaches to this question. I guess part of one thing that came up when I was writing this, and I maybe only said it once, but the image of roots really struck me when I was thinking about this, that the classics are at the root of our nation as Americans. I mean, of course, I'm only looking at this from the perspective of American citizenship. So I'm teaching a course right now called The Classics in Black Literature, and how indelible this stuff is, not just to the Founding Fathers, but to anyone who is thinking about citizenship, emancipation, slavery, any of these topics, is really striking to me. The material almost teaches itself. You go to Frederick Douglass, and if you look at Frederick Douglass from the standpoint of classical oratory, all of a sudden, all kinds of new approaches open up. Because we might often think that if the topic isn't a one-to-one equal, a one-to-one match, it's not there. But if you look at Douglass for rhetorical devices, structure of rhetoric, what one's audience is. Just go to Aristotle's Rhetoric and look at that and read read Douglas next to that. And all of a sudden, students are thinking about such things as the immigration debate, for example. It never struck me until teaching that course on Frederick Douglass that one thing missing from the immigration debate is, at least in the main public discourse, is the voice of the immigrant. Douglass became a moral instrument for emancipation because of his mastery of oratory. Anyway, that's just one thing that came up. And this goes on to any number of topics in the arts and beyond. Again, August Wilson. This stuff, I think some of the anxiety is from professional practitioners of classics, because people in theater studies read Aristotle's Poetics from day one.
For Professor Barsh, I liked your idea, what you talked about, using a classical education as kind of a method of easing some of the travails of multiculturalism. And it's an interesting tagline. I'd be really interested to hear the pitch. But do you see classics as a whole moving toward a more pragmatic approach, toward translating their value to the people that hold the purse strings, or is this kind of ad hoc, one of the few voices in the wilderness?
No, I don't see that happening, actually. But I've been trying to think about ways in which we could expand the audience for classics beyond the immediately obvious people who are either in the academy or who are in fields outside the academy that engage in these kinds of debates and reading. And as I suggested in the very brief presentation, I think the fact that classics in so many ways teaches a kind of flexibility about cultural thinking, about ethical thinking, about values and conflict and resolutions of that problem, that not only classics, but in fact the liberal arts in general, the humanities in general, really have a lot to offer in a world in which our contact with, the other with a capital O is becoming increasingly common. And also cultural gaffes are becoming increasingly common as two cultures meet and create friction. So that's still pretty vague, and it's certainly at the beginning point of what might be a development, but I hope something like that can and will happen.
If I could just follow up on Shadi's comments. I thought one of the important points that you made in your remarks is that it's a relatively recent idea that classics somehow, or the humanities, the liberal arts, are impractical, that they are ethereal, that they don't really, it's not part of the real world. And that has hurt us. Whoever is responsible, I'd like to meet him. Because once we say that, we have signed a death warrant. If we implicitly say, this doesn't really matter, doesn't mean it gets you a job, okay? It should get you anything you want to do. But once we make that argument, implicitly or explicitly, our days are truly numbered. And again, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And so I think we should, it doesn't mean that we have to, go corporate. I don't think that's the way to do it. But if we don't believe that, and if our students don't, they're not going to come to us. And so it's exciting material. It's extraordinarily imaginative and creative and compelling. And as long as we make it clear that, this is going to help you in life, it's going to help you in whatever you do in the world, then I think we'll do fine. The humanities will do fine. But if we are thought of, or if we think of ourselves as somehow aloof from the world, no, we will not survive.
Actually, I could add a comment in response to your comment. I don't think anybody would say that reading MLK Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail was ethereal or irrelevant. And yet, the last time I read Antigone, I thought these two texts, in fact, have incredible parallels. They should be taught side by side to teach students to think about how you determine between the justice of different kinds of law, whether it's divine law and political law or civic law and cult law. What do you do when clashing but absolute value schemes come into that kind of conflict? And it was, basically the subject of what Martin Luther King Jr. had to say in that particular address. So.
I have a very, very simple